Herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Folge des Podcasts Agilität in der Praxis von proagile.de. Mein Name ist Christian Müller und ich freue mich, dass du wieder mit dabei bist. Im Zuge meiner Recherche zu KI und neuen Tools bin ich auf Notebook LLM gestoßen. Das ist ein Informationsgenerator, der auf der Google-eigenen KI Gemini basiert. Das heißt, man kann bei Notebook LLM Informationen hinterlegen oder Recherchen zu bestimmten Themen anstellen und die KI aggregiert aus den hinterlegten Informationen oder aus den Fragen, die man hat, umfangreiche Informationsquellen, sowas wie FAQ und so weiter. Aber als weiteres Highlight bietet dieses Tool seit neuestem auch eine Podcast-Funktion. Das heißt, es generiert aus den aggregierten Informationen ein sehr authentisch wirkendes Gespräch zwischen zwei Menschen. Und ich habe das Tool also getestet und habe einen meiner Grundsatzartikel, die ich mal geschrieben habe, nämlich zum Thema agile Transformation in dem Tool hinterlegt. Und innerhalb von vielleicht 10 Minuten hat das Tool nicht nur alle relevanten Informationen inhaltlich richtig aggregiert und auf die wichtigsten Punkte zugespitzt, sondern es hat auch eine Podcast-Folge generiert. Das Ergebnis hat mich tatsächlich beeindruckt. Nicht nur inhaltlich, weil es nahezu alle wichtigen Punkte wiedergibt, sondern auch durch die weitere Anreicherung von Kontextinformationen, die tatsächlich relevant sind. Und bis auf wenige Details ist im Grunde nicht hörbar, dass es sich hierbei eben nicht um ein Gespräch zwischen zwei Menschen handelt, sondern um ein Gespräch, das von einem Computer erstellt wurde. Aktuell ist das Tool noch im Beta-Stadium und es gibt noch keine deutsche Version. Deswegen ist das Ergebnis und der Podcast auch in Englisch. Und dann würde ich sagen, gehen wir direkt rein und hören uns an, was das circa 15 Minuten lange Ergebnis zum Thema agile Transformation ist. Ich wünsche dir ganz viel Spaß beim Zuhören.
Okay, so ready to really dig into agile transformation. We're talking cutting through all the noise and figuring out what it actually means for your company. And to help us out, we're taking a deep dive into some insights from proagile.de. They're a German consultancy, super in-depth on all things agile.
Oh, I've heard of them. They've worked with some pretty big names, haven't they?
Yeah, definitely not new to the game. And they have some really interesting takes on, well, everything from ditching those old school ways of working to why becoming a learning organization is key, which honestly is something I'm really curious to dig into more.
Yeah, that always piques my interest too. It seems like everyone's talking about learning organizations these days, but what does it actually look like in practice?
Exactly. And they don't shy away from the tough stuff either, like why agile isn't a quick fix.
Which, let's be real, a lot of people seem to think it is.
Right. Like you can just sprinkle some agile magic and suddenly everything's perfect.
I wish it were that easy.
Me too. But anyway, before we get too far ahead, let's start with the basics. How do they actually define agile transformation?
Well, they frame it as working differently, which sounds simple enough.
Right.
But it goes way beyond just like changing up your to-do list. They talk about revamping routines, shaking up responsibilities, even questioning those deep-rooted strategies companies often cling to.
Oh, so it's about having the guts to say, hey, maybe what worked before doesn't cut it anymore?
Exactly. It's about being brave enough to find a better way. And that takes courage, for sure.
It's definitely not for the faint of heart. So it sounds like we're talking about a pretty big deal here, not just slapping on a new project management tool and calling it a day.
Definitely not. They have this great analogy. They call it the agile iceberg.
Oh, I love a good analogy. Tell me more.
So imagine an iceberg, right? The tip is what everyone sees, those tools, frameworks, the visible stuff.
Okay, I'm with you.
But what's really driving the change, the massive part hidden below the surface, that's the underlying principles and beliefs, the foundation of it all.
Okay, so it's about more than just the what, it's about the why behind it all.
Exactly. And they argue that without that solid foundation, you're just going through the motions without really embodying those core agile values.
Like trying to bake a cake without turning on the oven?
Perfect analogy. You might have all the right ingredients, but without that crucial element, it's not going to work.
It'll be a pretty sad unbaked cake.
Exactly. And speaking of things that won't work, one of the biggest myths they debunk is this idea of agile being a quick fix.
Yeah, which makes sense. You can't just sprinkle some agile dust and expect miracles overnight, right?
Definitely not. ProAgile.de is all about the long game. They emphasize that real transformation requires a fundamental mindset shift, a commitment to constantly learning and improving. It's not just about doing things differently. It's about being different.
It's like building a muscle you don't get ripped overnight.
Exactly. It takes time, effort, and consistency.
So how do they suggest companies actually start making this shift? Because it sounds like a pretty massive undertaking.
Well, they acknowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all approach,
Oh.
which is where their breakdown of the 3 forms of agile transformation comes in.
Oh, interesting. What are the 3 forms?
You've got evolutionary, revolutionary, and radical. And each one comes with its own set of considerations, benefits, and of course, challenges.
So let's break this down a bit. Evolutionary sounds like the slow and steady approach, right? What kind of company would that work best for?
I got it. Think of a large, well-established organization, maybe a little slow to adapt to new tech or those market shifts.
Okay, got it.
For them, an evolutionary approach allows for gradual implementation, maybe starting with pilot projects or specific teams before going organization-wide.
So dipping their toes in the water before diving headfirst.
Exactly. Less disruptive, but yeah, it takes more time.
Makes sense. Okay, what about revolutionary? That sounds a bit more, well, intense.
It does, doesn't it? Definitely implies a faster pace of change. Imagine a company facing huge market pressure or disruption.
Like a tech startup that needs to adapt super quickly to stay afloat.
Exactly. They might opt for a more revolutionary approach, implementing agile principles faster and across the whole organization.
Okay, so that brings us to radical, which, well, the name kind of speaks for itself.
It does, doesn't it? They describe it as this ground-up movement, where the company empowers its people to drive the change themselves.
Wow, that's a lot of trust.
There it is. It's highly collaborative, incredibly adaptable, but also incredibly rare. Not many organizations are set up to handle that level of autonomy.
Yeah, I can imagine. Not for everyone, that's for sure.
Definitely not. But they've actually included a really handy table on their website that summarizes all 3 approaches. Super helpful, especially for visual learners like me.
Oh, visuals are always a win. Okay, so we've got our foundation, right? Agile isn't a magic wand. It's a journey with different paths you can take. What else do they highlight as being super important in this whole transformation process?
One thing they really emphasize is making sure your organizational structure actually aligns with your agile goals. It's not enough to just adopt the practices. You need an environment that supports them, helps them thrive.
So it's like you wouldn't plant a delicate flower in a pot full of rocks, right?
Exactly.
You need the right soil, the right environment for it to flourish.
Exactly. They are all about aligning your system so they support agility, not stifle it. This includes everything from how decisions are made to how people communicate, even how performance is measured. It's fascinating how they bring it back to that idea of a learning organization.
Right, like it's something they're really passionate about.
Yeah, definitely a recurring theme for them.
And they're not just talking about like mandatory training sessions, are they?
No, not at all. They see a learning organization as one that's constantly evolving, adapting based on new info, new experiences, all of that.
Okay, so being able to roll with the punches, essentially.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where people are encouraged to experiment, where mistakes are seen as learning opportunities.
Which, let's be honest, can be a tough sell in some companies.
Oh, for sure.
Those ones that are stuck in that we've always done it this way mindset.
Right. And it requires a different kind of leadership too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
One that's comfortable with vulnerability, open to feedback, leaders who don't need to have all the answers.
It's more about guiding the team, right? Not
Yeah.
dictating every move.
Exactly. Leaders in a learning organization, they need to be facilitators, mentors, helping their teams navigate all the uncertainty, encouraging them to constantly improve.
Which actually, that makes me think of their breakdown of those 6 levels of agile transformation.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
They're pretty clear that it's not just a checklist you can breeze through.
Right. Definitely not a linear process. It's more like a interconnected system.
Mm-hmm.
Each level influences the others, supports the others,
Totally. So what are some of those levels, just to refresh our memory?
Let's see. There's establishing the right organizational structure, adapting infrastructure, nurturing knowledge creation. Then there's utilizing frameworks effectively, increasing speed.
Okay, keeping up with the pace of things.
Exactly. And then, crucially, developing true leadership. That's a big one.
And speaking of big things, with AI changing the game across industries, which of those levels do you think are most crucial right now?
That's a great question. And honestly, with all this AI disruption, I'd say 2 levels really stand out.
Okay, I'm listening. Hit me.
First one, increasing speed. ProAgile.de, they make a really strong case for methodologies like lean startup.
I've heard of that.
It's all about rapid prototyping, iterative development, getting your products, your services, whatever you're working on in front of customers, quickly get that feedback.
So it's about being agile, literally, responding quickly to what the market wants, not spending a year on development only to launch something that's already obsolete.
Exactly. In this AI world, everything's moving so fast. Being able to adapt, iterate quickly, that's crucial. And that's where the second level comes in developing true leadership.
Because it's not enough to just keep pace with the technology, right?
It's about changing how you lead, how you empower your teams to keep up with that pace.
It's about fostering an environment where they can make decisions, experiment, take ownership, all of that.
Exactly. It's trusting your team, encouraging them to push boundaries, and creating that safety net where it's okay to fail, as long as they learn from it.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Creating a culture that's not afraid to make mistakes.
And that's not always easy. It's a very different way of leading than what we often see in more traditional organizations.
For sure. So do they give any real-world examples of companies that are actually nailing these levels, especially with all this AI stuff happening?
Oh, absolutely. One company that comes to mind is, that streaming service.
The one that's always recommending shows I might like.
That's the one. They seem to always be one step ahead.
It's kind of creepy how good their recommendations are sometimes.
I know. But that's because they've really embraced this whole test and learn approach. They're constantly rolling out new features, gathering user data, using AI to personalize the whole experience. And they're not afraid to experiment, even if it means some things don't work out.
Which honestly is how you learn and get better. So it sounds like they're using AI not just to automate tasks, but to actually be more agile and responsive to what their customers want.
Exactly. And it's a great example of how you can leverage AI and agile methodologies together to drive innovation, stay ahead of the curve in a market that's constantly changing.
It's interesting because it's like AI is often talked about in terms of replacing human workers, but this shows how it can actually enhance what humans are already doing.
Right. And that ties into ProAgile.de's point about how disruption demands agility. In a world that's constantly being reshaped by technology, being able to adapt quickly, it's not just a nice to have anymore. It's essential for survival.
Yeah, it's not about keeping up with the Joneses anymore. It's about outrunning the robots, or at least figuring out how to work with them.
Exactly. And that brings us to another one of their key points. And this one might seem counterintuitive at first. Descaling before scaling.
Okay, now that's the one that really threw me for a loop. How can you shrink something before you grow it? It seems, I don't know, kind of backwards.
I know, it seems like a paradox, right? But it's actually quite clever when you really think about it. They're saying, before you even consider scaling up your agile processes, you need to take a hard look at your organization.
Identify any bottlenecks.
Exactly. Anything that might be hindering agility, get rid of it.
So it's like cleaning out the clutter before you bring in the good stuff.
Perfect analogy. Think of it like building a house you wouldn't build on a foundation full of cracks, right?
It's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. You'd fix those structural issues first to make sure you have a solid base. And descaling is kind of the same thing for your organization. Identifying outdated procedures, bureaucratic hurdles, even those ingrained mindsets that are slowing you down and holding you back from being truly agile.
So if you try to scale up with all that baggage, you're just amplifying the problem, not fixing it.
Exactly. It's not just about speed either. It's about improving things, making them better. And by removing those obstacles, you're freeing up your teams to focus on what matters, delivering value to customers, adapting quickly to change, all that.
It's like taking your car to the mechanic and saying, okay, before you soup up the engine, make sure the brakes work.
Exactly. You don't want to go full speed ahead without a solid foundation. It's about setting yourself up for sustainable growth.
Not just growth for growth's sake, right?
Right. It's about optimizing for agility, making sure you can handle all the curveballs the business world throws at you.
And speaking of curveballs, ProAgile.de doesn't shy away from the whole AI thing.
Yeah, how could they? It's like the ultimate disruption, right?
Totally. Changing everything.
You're reshaping industries, upending those traditional ways of doing business. It's huge.
It's like we're all trying to learn a new dance, but the music keeps changing.
And the dance floor is moving too. But that's where they see Agile being so important. Not just a methodology, but like a survival skill.
Because if you can't adapt quickly in this environment, you're toast, right?
Pretty much. They argue that being able to experiment, iterate, all of that, it's crucial, especially with AI accelerating the pace of change so much.
So we're all on that runaway train trying to figure out how to stay on board.
And that's why ProAgile.de stresses the importance of continuous learning and adaptation for individuals and organizations. It's the only way to thrive in this kind of world.
So it's not enough to just learn new skills. You have to be constantly learning, growing, challenging your own assumptions, all of that.
Exactly. And that takes humility. Recognizing that you don't have all the answers, being open to new ways of thinking, new ways of working.
Which can be tough, but it's also exciting, right? Because it means we get to shape the future, figure out what it means to be human in this age of AI.
Exactly. It's about harnessing the power of AI, not being afraid of it, using it to unlock new possibilities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into agile transformation, what are some key takeaways our listeners can walk away with? What are those nuggets of wisdom they can apply right now?
Well, one thing that really stuck with me is their advice to limit the number of projects you're tackling at once.
Oh, interesting. Less is more.
Exactly. They argue that focusing on fewer initiatives, but with more depth and intention, actually leads to faster, more sustainable results.
Quality over quantity.
Exactly. Another big one is radical transparency. Make sure everyone has the information they need when they need it.
No more silos, no more hoarding information.
Exactly. And finally, build strong relationships with your customers. Involve them early and often in the development process.
So collaboration is key both internally and externally.
Exactly. Break down those silos, build trust, and work together.
I love it. This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about agile transformation.
Me too. It's been great.
And before we go, I always like to leave our listeners with something to think about. So here's a question for you to ponder. In a world where AI is becoming increasingly sophisticated, where does that leave us? What does it really mean to be agile in the years to come?
That's a big one. It really makes you think about the future, doesn't it?
It does. It's not just about adapting our processes anymore. It's about adapting our mindset, our approach to, well, everything.
Because the future of Agile, it's not just about methodologies or frameworks. It's about embracing that continuous learning, fostering creativity, those uniquely human qualities that AI can't replicate.
On that note, we'll leave you to ponder that thought. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to proagile.de and other resources. And until next time, keep diving deep.
Soweit der Podcast von Notebook LLM, basierend auf Google Gemini und meinem Text zum Thema agile Transformation. Ich weiß nicht, wie es dir gerade geht. Ich war, als ich das Ergebnis das erste Mal gehört hatte, wirklich beeindruckt. Und nachdem ich etwas über die potenziellen Auswirkungen dieser Technologie nachgedacht hatte, sind mir natürlich viele Ideen in den Kopf geschossen. Ich habe mich zum Beispiel gefragt, was macht das mit Podcasts im Ganzen? Was macht das mit Geschäftsmodellen von Firmen wie zum Beispiel Blinkist, die ja in der Vergangenheit sehr erfolgreich damit waren, Inhalte von Büchern zu subsumieren und zu kuratieren und in Audioformat wiederzugeben? Aber auch generell, was macht das mit Industriezweigen, die auf Sprache basieren, angefangen von Support, weitergehend über Audioproduktion und weiteres. Also ich glaube, hier steht uns eine große Disruption ins Haus. Das wird viel verändern. Die Qualität ist heute schon sehr gut und wenn wir davon ausgehen, dass diese Modelle lernen, die werden trainiert, dann glaube ich, werden wir hier in vielen, vielen Bereichen eine Veränderung erfahren. Stell dir gern einmal diese 3 Fragen. Wo siehst du das weitere Potenzial dieser Technologie? Was macht das mit Teilen der Wirtschaft? Und wo könnte das Geschäftsmodell deines eigenen Unternehmens davon betroffen sein? Du kannst mir gerne eine E-Mail schreiben. Ich packe die Kontaktdaten zu mir in die Shownotes. Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören und ich freue mich, wenn du beim nächsten Mal auch wieder mit dabei bist. Mach's gut.